Please, sir. I can sing for your daughter. I promise I'll do my best. That's what 27-year-old Elizabeth Parker said to the security guard at the Golden Palace Resort, right before the most expensive wedding in the city was about to fall apart. Her words made everyone nearby burst out laughing. But Elizabeth didn't run away. She didn't lower her head. She just stood there in her worn-out coat and her shoes with the hole in the toe, one hand resting gently on her round pregnant belly, and she looked at the guard with steady, quiet eyes. Hello friends. Welcome to our story. Before we start, please like this video and subscribe. Also, tell us in the comments, where are you watching from? Florida? London? Maybe South Africa or Jamaica? We want to know. Inside the Golden Palace Resort, Victor Radisson was trying very hard not to explode with anger. His daughter's wedding was happening right now. 500 guests were sitting at tables decorated with white roses and golden ribbons. Crystal chandeliers hung from the ceiling, sparkling like stars. Each table had fancy plates that cost more than some people's cars. Giant screens on the walls showed pictures of his daughter Sarah and her new husband Michael, smiling in the sunshine from their engagement photographs. Everything had cost Victor over $200,000. Everything was perfect, except for one thing. The singer wasn't coming. Victor stood backstage, his phone pressed so hard against his ear it was starting to leave a red mark. His face was turning the color of a tomato. A small vein on the side of his forehead was poking out in a way that made his assistant Patricia very nervous whenever she saw it. What do you mean he's not coming? Victor said into the phone. His voice was dangerously quiet, the kind of quiet that is actually louder than shouting if you know what to listen for. I paid Marcus Miller $50,000. The contract was signed 3 months ago. The voice on the other end said something about an emergency. Something about a flight. Something about being terribly, terribly sorry. Sorry? Victor's voice finally cracked open. Sorry doesn't help me right now. My guests are waiting. This is my daughter's wedding. Do you have any idea? He stopped himself, took one breath. Find him. Or find me someone else. You have 20 minutes. He hung up and set his phone down on the table beside him. He set it down very carefully because what he actually wanted to do was throw it through the wall, and Victor Radisson had not become one of the most powerful men in the city by giving in to what he wanted to do. Patricia, the event manager, stood nearby, twisting her hands together like she was trying to wring water from them. She was sweating even though the air conditioning was running at full power. Sir, she said carefully, we're already calling every professional singer in the city. Every single one. We will find someone. I promise you we. How many minutes has that stage been empty? Victor asked. Patricia looked at her watch. 12 minutes, sir. 12 minutes. Victor repeated it slowly like he was tasting something bad. Do you know what 12 minutes of silence sounds like in a room with 500 wealthy people who paid $500 a plate to be here tonight? Patricia opened her mouth. It sounds like failure, Victor said. He straightened his jacket and looked toward the curtain that separated the backstage area from the ballroom. People don't remember the flowers. They don't remember the food. They remember the thing that went wrong. They go home and they tell their friends and their friends tell their friends, and before the week is out, every person in this city who matters will have heard that Victor Radisson's daughter's wedding fell apart because he couldn't keep a stage filled. Sir. Fix it. He turned and walked toward the window. Fix it in the next 20 minutes, or I will find a way to make sure this is the last event you ever manage in this city. Patricia nodded quickly, her head bobbing up and down. Then she hurried away, already dialing her phone. Victor stood at the window with his hands clasped behind his back and looked out at the dark city below him. Victor Radisson had built his life from almost nothing. He had grown up in a small house with a leaky roof and a mother who worked 2 jobs and a father who had walked out when Victor was 9 years old. He had watched his mother struggle, and he had decided at a very young age that he would never struggle like that. He had worked and studied and pushed and clawed his way up year by year, deal by deal, until he owned 15 businesses, hotels, shopping malls, office buildings, restaurants. He had houses in 4 different cities. When he walked into a room, people stood up straighter. When he spoke, everyone listened. But tonight, standing backstage at his own daughter's wedding, he felt 9 years old again. Small. Out of control. Helpless. He hated that feeling more than almost anything in the world. Out in the ballroom, the guests were starting to notice that something was wrong. Whispers moved from table to table like a breeze blowing through tall grass, quiet but impossible to ignore. At table 7, Mrs. Henderson, a woman who wore a lot of pearls and had opinions about everything, leaned toward her husband and spoke behind her hand. I told you Victor always overdoes it. He wants everything to be bigger and better than everyone else. Now look. The stage has been empty for 10 minutes. Her husband grunted. He was eating his bread roll and trying to stay out of it. At table 12, a man in a gray suit checked his watch for the 6th time. His name was Gerald Foster and he had an early flight in the morning and he had only come tonight because turning down Victor Radisson's wedding invitation was not something you did if you valued your business relationships. 5 more minutes, he muttered to himself. If nothing happens in 5 more minutes, I'm going home. At table 3, right near the front, Sarah sat in her beautiful white wedding dress. It was covered in tiny seed pearls that her father had spent 3 weeks arguing with the designer about. Her dark hair was pinned up with diamond clips. She looked by any measure like a princess. But her hands were shaking in her lap. Something's wrong, she whispered to Michael, her new husband, who was sitting beside her looking very handsome and also slightly concerned. Your father will fix it, Michael said. He squeezed her hand. He promised me this would be perfect. Sarah looked at the empty stage. The microphone stand was up there alone under the spotlight, and somehow that single microphone with no one singing into it looked sadder than anything else in the whole grand room. He promised me Marcus Miller. I've loved his music since I was 15 years old. Sarah. Please don't tell me it's fine. She looked at him with wide eyes. I can see on your face that you don't think it's fine either. Michael did not say anything to that. Because she was right. Meanwhile, on the other side of the building entirely, near the service entrance where the delivery trucks came and went, Elizabeth Parker was having the best moment of her whole week. She had found food. Real, actual, beautiful food. Elizabeth had not eaten a proper meal in 3 days. Yesterday she had found half a bread roll sitting on top of a trash can, still in its paper bag, untouched, as if someone had set it there on purpose, though probably they hadn't. The day before that she had eaten a small container of crackers she had bought with the last coins at the bottom of her jacket pocket and then drunk water from a public fountain and tried to convince her stomach to stop growling. She was 7 months pregnant. She could feel the baby was healthy, she could tell by the way it moved, small and sure and constant, little kicks and nudges from the inside like a tiny person reminding her, I'm here. I'm still here. Keep going. Elizabeth always talked back quietly when no one was nearby to hear. I know, she would whisper, pressing her palm flat against the side of her belly where she felt the kicks most. I know you're there. I'm not going anywhere. And she meant it. No matter how cold the bench got, no matter how long the shelter lines were, no matter how many people walked past without looking at her, she was not going anywhere. She had made that baby a promise and Elizabeth Parker kept her promises. So when she had turned the corner onto Harrington Avenue that evening and caught the smell, oh, that smell, warm and buttery and rich and real, drifting from somewhere behind the enormous white building, her feet had started moving toward it before she had even made a decision. The Golden Palace Resort. She knew the name, of course. Everyone in the city knew it. It sat at the end of Harrington Avenue like something from a dream, pale stone columns, brass door handles, flowers tumbling from urns on either side of the entrance and great waterfalls of white and gold. The kind of building that made you straighten up a little just from looking at it, even if you had no business being there. Elizabeth definitely had no business being there. But the smell of that food was something she could not argue with. She followed the scent around to the side of the building, where a wide concrete path led to the service entrance. 2 large catering trucks were parked there, their back doors open. Staff in white jackets moved quickly back and forth carrying covered trays, not paying much attention to anything except where they were going. Elizabeth stopped at the edge of the path. Her stomach made a sound that she was grateful no one could hear. She knew she shouldn't be here. She knew how she looked, the worn coat, the cracked shoes, the bag over her shoulder that held everything she owned. She knew that any minute someone would notice her and tell her to leave. But the baby kicked twice in quick succession as if to say please, and Elizabeth took a breath and walked forward. She was almost at the service door when the security guard stepped out. He was a big man, broad in the shoulders, with a serious face and a radio on his belt. He stopped when he saw her and for a moment they just looked at each other. Private event, he said. You'll need to move on. I know, Elizabeth said. I'm sorry. I'm not trying to cause any trouble. She paused. Her pride pushed at her from the inside the way it always did. She pushed back. I haven't eaten in a few days. I thought maybe there might be some food going to waste. Anything at all. I wouldn't ask if I had another option. The guard's eyes moved to her belly and then back to her face. He wasn't cruel, she could see that. He just had a job to do. I can't help you with that, he said. But his voice had gone softer. Please. She said it simply. No drama. No tears. Just the plain word said plainly. Please. The guard opened his mouth. Behind him, the service door flew open. A woman in a black dress came rushing out, a phone pressed to her ear, her face slick with panic sweat. She nearly ran into the guard. Excuse me, sorry, she gasped and kept moving, already talking rapidly into her phone. No, I've tried 3 agencies, nobody's available on this short notice. Yes, I know. She disappeared around the corner. The guard watched her go with a slightly puzzled look. Then from inside, through the open service door, came the sound of an angry voice. Not shouting exactly, but tight. The voice of a man who was used to being obeyed and was currently not being obeyed. Then what exactly am I paying you for, Patricia? What is your purpose here tonight if not to solve exactly this kind of? The door swung shut and the voice cut off. The guard exhaled through his nose. Big drama tonight, he said almost to himself. What happened? Elizabeth asked. She wasn't sure why she asked. It came out before she could stop it. The guard looked at her and then, maybe because she was clearly harmless, maybe because he needed to say it to someone, he said, the singer canceled. Famous guy Marcus Miller. Was supposed to perform tonight, backed out an hour ago. $500,000 worth of wedding and no entertainment. The boss is losing his mind. Elizabeth stood very still. Something moved through her, a feeling she couldn't quite name. Not excitement. More like recognition. Like hearing a piece of music you know from somewhere but can't quite place. She looked at the service door. Then she looked at the guard. I can sing, she said. The guard stared at her. Then he laughed. Not a mean laugh. More the laugh of someone who has heard something so unexpected they don't know what else to do with it. Lady. I know how that sounds. She kept her voice calm. I know what I look like right now. But I can actually sing. My mother taught me. I've been singing my whole life. She paused. You said he'll pay anyone who can do the job? I said the boss is looking for someone. I didn't say anything about. Then let me try. She looked at him steadily. What does he lose by letting me try? The guard looked at her for a long moment. He looked at her coat, her shoes, her bag, her belly. He looked at her face. He saw something there that made him go quiet for a second. Then he said slowly, wait here. He went inside. Elizabeth stood alone on the concrete path next to the catering trucks. The cold air pressed against her thin jacket. Somewhere above her, through the tall windows of the ballroom, she could see the glow of chandeliers and the shapes of hundreds of people sitting at tables, waiting. She put her hand on her belly. I know, she whispered. I know it sounds crazy. But let's just see. The baby kicked. Elizabeth smiled. The guard came back 2 minutes later. His face was hard to read. He'll see you, he said. But I'm warning you right now, the man in there does not have a lot of patience tonight, and he is not going to be kind about it if you waste his time. I understand, Elizabeth said. You sure you want to do this? Elizabeth looked at the door. She thought about 3 days without a real meal. She thought about the bench outside the library, and the way cold air came through the crack in her shoe, and the shelter that had no space last night and probably no space tonight either. She thought about the baby, growing and kicking and trusting her completely. And she thought, very briefly, about her mother. About Clara Parker, who used to sing while she hung the laundry, who said that a voice was a living thing, who told Elizabeth that real courage wasn't the absence of fear, it was doing the thing anyway with the fear right there beside you. I'm sure, Elizabeth said. And she walked through the door. The inside of the Golden Palace Resort was like stepping into another world. Elizabeth had seen nice buildings before. She had walked past them, looked through their windows, admired them from the outside the way you admire something that belongs to someone else. But she had never actually been inside a place like this, and the difference between looking at it and standing in it was the difference between seeing a picture of the ocean and suddenly finding yourself standing in it up to your knees. The corridor they walked through was wide and carpeted in deep red, the kind of carpet so thick your feet sank into it a little with every step. The walls were cream-colored with gold trim along the edges and bottom, and every few feet there was a small light fixture shaped like a candle flame that threw warm yellow light in soft circles. It smelled like flowers and something expensive that Elizabeth could not name, not perfume exactly, more like the idea of perfume. The idea of luxury. She followed the guard, whose name he had told her quietly was Thomas, through a side corridor and then through a pair of heavy double doors that opened into the backstage area behind the main ballroom. And that was where she saw him. Victor Radisson was standing with his back to them, looking at a tablet that a young man in a headset was holding out to him. He was tall, taller than she had expected, and his tuxedo fit him the way expensive things fit people who have always worn expensive things. His hair was silver at the temples. His posture was the posture of a man who had never in his adult life allowed himself to slouch. Thomas cleared his throat. "Mr. Radisson, sir." Victor turned. His eyes moved to Elizabeth immediately, and they did what almost everyone's eyes did. They took in the coat, the shoes, the bag, the belly, and something in his expression tightened almost imperceptibly. Not rudeness exactly. More like the face of a man recalculating something. "This is the woman I told you about, sir," Thomas said. "She says she can sing." A silence settled over the backstage area. Patricia, the event manager, had appeared from somewhere and was now standing off to the side, her phone still in her hand, watching with an expression that Elizabeth could not quite read. Two other staff members had also stopped what they were doing. Everyone was looking at her. Elizabeth stood straight. Victor looked at her for a long moment. Then he said in a voice that was perfectly level, "What's your name?" "Elizabeth Parker." "Have you performed professionally, Elizabeth?" "No, sir." Something flickered in his eyes. "Have you performed at all? Any stage experience?" "No, sir." The silence got a little heavier. "So," Victor said slowly, "you have no professional experience, no stage experience, and you are—" He gestured briefly, carefully, in the direction of her stomach, heavily pregnant. "And you want to perform at my daughter's wedding reception in front of 500 guests." Put that way, Elizabeth thought, it did sound rather impossible. "Yes, sir," she said. Victor looked at her for another moment. Then he looked at Patricia. Patricia gave a tiny shrug that seemed to say, "I have no better options." Victor looked back at Elizabeth. "I'll make you a deal," he said. He said it loudly enough that several nearby staff members turned to listen. Elizabeth got the sense that this was not an accident, that Victor Radisson rarely did anything by accident. "I will bring you onto that stage," he said, "in front of every person in that room, and I will give you a chance to sing." He paused. "But I have a condition." Elizabeth waited. "If you can sing one song, just one, and keep the entire room completely silent from beginning to end, not one person talking, not one person laughing, not one whispered conversation, I will pay you $15,000. Elizabeth heard Patricia suck in a small breath behind her. "And if I can't do that?" Elizabeth asked. Something moved in Victor's eyes. It might have been respect for the question. It might have been something else. "Then you'll have had a chance to sing at the finest wedding reception in the city this year," he said. "And I'll have security escort you out quietly with no further trouble." It wasn't generous. Elizabeth knew that. The condition was almost designed for her to fail, because why would 500 wealthy, elegantly dressed wedding guests stay quiet for a stranger in a worn coat? They would laugh. They were probably already looking for something to talk about. But $15,000. $15,000 was a new beginning. It was a safe place for her baby to come home to. It was doctor's visits and a warm room and food in the cupboard. It was the difference between the bench outside the library and an actual life. "All right," Elizabeth said. "I agree." Victor nodded once. Then he turned to Patricia. "Get her ready. 5 minutes." Patricia moved quickly once she had her instructions. Elizabeth had to give her that. Within 2 minutes she had found a chair for Elizabeth to sit on, a glass of water, and a calm, businesslike manner that suggested she had handled stranger things than this, though her expression suggested she had not. "Do you need anything?" Patricia asked. "Any specific song arrangement? Do you need the house pianist to accompany you?" Elizabeth thought about it. "Yes," she said. "A piano would help. Something simple in a minor key. I'll guide him once we start." Patricia looked mildly surprised, then nodded and went to find the pianist. Thomas brought her the glass of water and then stood nearby, not hovering, just present. Elizabeth appreciated that. She drank the water slowly. From beyond the heavy stage curtain came the sound of 500 people, the low, continuous murmur of conversations, the clink of glasses, a ripple of laughter from somewhere near the back. It was the sound of people who were comfortable and well-fed and waiting to be entertained, and it had a particular quality to it, a kind of casual confidence, that Elizabeth recognized as the sound of people who had never had to worry very much about anything. She was about to walk into the middle of all of that. She pressed her hand to her stomach. The baby moved, a long, slow shift, not a kick exactly, more like a turning over. Like getting comfortable. Elizabeth almost laughed. "You think this is a good idea?" she whispered. The baby moved again. "Okay," Elizabeth said quietly. "Okay. We'll try." She thought about Daniel. She hadn't let herself think about him much. It hurt too badly and used too much energy, and energy was something she couldn't afford to waste right now. But sitting in the quiet of the backstage corridor, waiting, she let the memory come. She had met Daniel Parker when she was 23. He had been fixing her neighbor's car in the parking lot of her apartment building, lying on his back on a piece of cardboard, half of him hidden under the vehicle. She had nearly tripped over his legs. He had come sliding out from under the car with grease on his nose and a startled expression, and she had laughed before she could stop herself, and he had laughed too, and that had been that. They had been happy. She was sure of it, not the way people are sometimes sure of things that didn't actually happen, but the way you are sure of something you genuinely lived. Their apartment on Crane Street. Friday night pizza. The yellow kitchen curtain she had sewn herself from fabric she bought at the discount market. The way Daniel would come home and immediately start telling her about his day before he had even taken off his jacket. The lottery had changed him in ways she still didn't fully understand. She had tried, in the weeks before he left, to find the Daniel she had married underneath all the new things. The new friends, the new habits, the new version of himself that he seemed to be trying on like a costume. She had tried to reach him, with patience, with questions, with dinners made the way he liked them, with long conversations late at night after the new friends had finally gone. But he had already made up his mind. I'm not ready for this. I'm sorry. 7 words. And then nothing. The worst part, the part that still made her chest hurt if she let herself think about it, was not the abandonment itself. People left. She knew that, had always known it somewhere deep in herself since her mother died. People left and the world kept moving. The worst part was that he had left the baby too. This small, unborn person who had done nothing except exist, who had no choice about when or where or to whom they arrived. Daniel had looked at the news of this baby's existence and decided it was too much trouble. Too complicated. Too much a reminder of the life he was trying to leave behind. Elizabeth would not forgive him for that. She was not sure she was capable of it. Mrs. Parker? She looked up. Patricia was back, and beside her was a slight young man with kind eyes and a bow tie that was slightly crooked. He was carrying sheet music under one arm. This is James, Patricia said. He's our house pianist. He says he can work with whatever you need. James gave her a small, encouraging smile. He looked about 25, and he had the slightly rumpled look of someone who had been pulled from a side room in a hurry. I heard what you're doing, he said quietly so only she could hear. That's brave. Elizabeth looked at him. Or stupid. He thought about it. Maybe both, he said honestly. What are we playing? She told him. He listened carefully, asked 2 questions, nodded slowly. I can do that, he said. Do you want me to follow you or lead? Follow me, she said. Stay close and follow where I go. Can you do that? Yes, he said with the confidence of someone who actually meant it. Good. Elizabeth finished the last of her water and set the glass down. She stood up slowly, one hand on the armrest the way she had to now. She straightened her jacket. She pushed her hair back from her face. She could not fix the coat. She could not fix the shoes. She could not make herself look like she belonged at a $200,000 wedding. She was what she was, a 27-year-old pregnant woman who had been sleeping on park benches and surviving on leftovers, about to walk out onto a stage in front of 500 strangers. But she had her voice. And her voice had never, not once in her entire life, let her down. Victor Radisson walked out onto the stage first. Elizabeth watched from the wings as the room gradually quieted. It didn't take long. He had the kind of presence that rooms responded to automatically, the way sunflowers respond to light without being asked. Ladies and gentlemen, Victor said into the microphone. His voice was smooth and controlled, and you would not have known from listening to it that 20 minutes ago he had been backstage with a vein pulsing in his forehead. We have a slight change to this evening's program. As some of you may have heard, our scheduled performer was unfortunately unable to join us tonight. A murmur moved through the room. However, Victor continued, we have a replacement performer who has generously offered to sing for us this evening. A brief pause. I've made her a small challenge. If she can hold this entire room in complete silence, not one conversation, not one whispered word, from the beginning of her song to the end, she'll be receiving a $15,000 reward. Now the murmur was louder. Elizabeth could hear individual voices cutting through it. Who is it? Is it someone famous? 15,000? Who is he kidding? Ladies and gentlemen, Victor said, cutting through the noise cleanly. Please welcome, Elizabeth Parker. Elizabeth walked out onto the stage. The light hit her first, warm and bright and coming from multiple directions at once, the kind of stage lighting that makes everything beyond the edge of the stage look very dark by comparison. She could see the first 2 or 3 rows clearly, faces upturned, glasses in hand, expressions ranging from curious to puzzled to already amused. Then the whispers started. She heard them even through the light and the soft background music that had been playing from the speakers. They moved through the room like a wave, not a big wave, just a ripple, but impossible to miss. Who is that? Is she pregnant? What is she wearing? Victor can't be serious. A laugh. Two laughs. Somewhere near the middle of the room, a woman said something to her table companion behind her hand, and they both stifled giggles. Elizabeth walked to the microphone. She could see Victor standing at the side of the stage, watching her with an expression she still couldn't entirely read. She could see Thomas near the back, arms folded, his big face carefully neutral. She could see the bride, Sarah, in white at the front table, leaning forward with a small frown of confusion. Elizabeth looked out at the 500 faces looking back at her. She thought, they have already decided. And then she thought, that's all right. People can change their minds. She looked down for a moment at her hands resting on the sides of the microphone stand. Then she looked back up at the room. She nodded once to James at the piano. And James began to play. The opening notes from the piano were soft. Almost too soft, like James was being careful, like he understood without being told that this moment needed to be approached gently, the way you approach something fragile that might break if you come at it too fast. The melody he played was simple. Just a few notes, repeating, building on themselves slowly. The kind of melody that doesn't announce itself but instead slips quietly into the room and sits down beside you before you've noticed it arrived. A few people in the audience shifted in their seats. Most of them were still talking. At table 9, a man in a blue suit was in the middle of a story about a golf trip, and he kept going, barely glancing at the stage. At table 15, 4 women were leaning in together over something on one of their phones, laughing quietly. At table 2, right near the front, a group of older men were deep in what looked like a business conversation, their heads close together, their voices low but steady. Nobody was really listening yet. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She did what her mother had taught her to do before she sang. She breathed, long and slow, all the way down. Not a performance breath, not a getting ready breath, but the kind of breath that goes all the way to the bottom of you and finds what's sitting there. The real thing. The true thing. What was sitting at the bottom of Elizabeth Parker tonight was not pretty. It was the night Daniel left. It was the sound of her key not working in the lock. It was 3 days without real food and the baby kicking and the bench outside the library and 50 shelter doors that were always full. It was the sound of laughter from this very room just 2 minutes ago when she walked out onto this stage. It was her mother's voice and the yellow kitchen curtain, and the small pot of basil on the windowsill that had died because no one was there to water it anymore. She took all of it, and she opened her mouth and she sang. The first note came out quietly. Not soft the way nervous is soft, not small or uncertain or apologetic. Quiet the way a river is quiet in the moment just before it opens up into something wide and deep and unstoppable. A single note that rose from somewhere low in her chest and moved out into the room like a hand reaching forward. The man in the blue suit kept talking. But the woman sitting next to him stopped responding. She had turned her head slightly toward the stage. Not all the way, just enough. The way you turn when you hear something in another room and you're not sure yet what it is. Elizabeth moved into the second line of the melody. Her voice opened up a little more, not louder, just fuller, the way a door opens wider. It had a quality to it that was difficult to describe to someone who hadn't heard it. It was warm, but there was something underneath the warmth that wasn't warm at all. Something that told the truth about where warmth comes from, which is not from comfort but from the memory of cold. At table 15, the 4 women with the phone looked up. One of them set the phone face down on the table without thinking about it. At table 9, the man in the blue suit got to the punchline of his golf story and laughed, and realized midway through the laugh that no one was laughing with him. His tablemates were all looking at the stage. He turned. He looked at the stage too. Elizabeth was not thinking about any of this. She was not watching faces or counting conversations or monitoring the room. She was somewhere else entirely, the place that singing took her when she did it right, which was not a physical place but a state of being, a kind of open door inside herself that she had learned to step through since she was very small. The song she sang had no words. That was the thing about it. She was not singing anyone else's lyrics, not performing a song she had learned from a record or a class. She was singing the way her mother had taught her to sing when words weren't enough. When what needed to be said was too big for language. Her mother called it wordless singing, which was not a technical term but described it perfectly. A melody that carried meaning the way water carries light, not by possessing it but by moving through it. She sang about loss. She sang about the particular kind of loss that comes not from death but from someone choosing to leave. The kind that leaves you standing in a kitchen holding a piece of paper with 7 words on it, trying to understand how a person you loved could look at you and decide you weren't worth staying for. She sang about the cold. About knowing every bench in a 3-mile radius. About watching other people's lights go on in warm windows and feeling, not envy exactly but a kind of gentle aching distance. About walking past bakeries and not going in. About counting crackers. And underneath all of it, running through the center of the song like a thread of gold running through dark cloth, she sang about the baby. About talking to someone you hadn't met yet. About making promises you weren't sure you could keep and keeping them anyway because that's what love asks of you. About the strange, fierce, completely unreasonable hope that lives inside a person who has lost almost everything and still chooses to believe that tomorrow might be different. She didn't decide to sing about any of these things. They simply came out because they were true, and truth, real truth, the kind that lives in the body and not just in the mind, is what a voice like Elizabeth's was built to carry. By the end of the first verse, the Table 9 conversation had stopped completely. By the end of the second verse, Table 15 was silent. Somewhere around the middle of the song, a remarkable thing happened in the grand ballroom of the Golden Palace Resort. A thing that had probably never happened before in a room full of that many wealthy, important, self-assured people. Everyone stopped talking. Not all at once. It happened gradually, like lights going out in a building one window at a time, from the front to the back to the furthest corners. Each person fell quiet in their own moment, at the point where Elizabeth's voice finally reached them and they understood, without being told, without thinking about it, that something real was happening on that stage. Something that deserved to be listened to. Gerald Foster from Table 12, who had been checking his watch and thinking about his early flight, was no longer thinking about his flight. He was sitting with both hands flat on the table and his eyes fixed on the stage, and he could not have told you when exactly he had stopped thinking about the flight because he genuinely could not remember. Mrs. Henderson from Table 7 had stopped talking entirely. Her husband glanced over at her at some point and noticed that her mouth was pressed into a thin, careful line, the way mouths look when people are trying to control their expressions. She was gripping her napkin in her lap. Sarah, the bride in her white dress at Table 3, had her hand over her mouth. Her new husband Michael had his arm around her shoulders and he was holding on a little tighter than necessary, because he was trying to hold himself together and it was not entirely working. The room was so quiet that Elizabeth's voice was the only sound in it. That and James at the piano, who was following her exactly as he had promised, close and careful and attentive, his eyes moving between his keys and her back, his playing adjusting in real time to the places her voice went, like a shadow that matches every movement without delay. Victor Radisson was standing at the side of the stage. He had folded his arms when Elizabeth walked out, the posture of a man who was watching something with professional detachment, evaluating it, ready to judge. His face had been neutral in the practiced way of a man who had spent decades making sure his face did not tell people things he wasn't ready to share. That face had changed. He wasn't sure when. Somewhere in the middle of the song he had noticed his arms were no longer folded. He had noticed that he was standing very still in a way that was different from his usual stillness. Not the stillness of control, but the stillness of someone who has been stopped. He was looking at Elizabeth. Not the coat. Not the shoes. Not the belly. Not the worn bag she had set down somewhere backstage. He was watching a young woman standing at a microphone with nothing but her voice and the absolute truth of her own life, offering it to 500 strangers who had laughed at her 10 minutes ago, and he was watching her do it without flinching. Victor Radisson had been in more business negotiations than he could count. He had sat across the table from some of the most powerful people in the country and held his position and not backed down. He thought of himself as a man who had seen a great deal and was difficult to surprise. Elizabeth Parker surprised him. He felt something move in his chest that he hadn't felt in a long time, something that had nothing to do with business or reputation or the disaster that tonight had briefly threatened to become. He pressed his lips together. He looked away for a moment at the ceiling. Then he looked back at her because he found he couldn't not. The song was moving toward its end now. Elizabeth could feel it the way you feel the end of a long walk. Not tiredness exactly, but a kind of arrival. The melody was circling back, the way melodies do, coming back to the place it started but carrying everything that had happened in between. All that weight held in music. Her voice rose. Just once, just for a moment near the end, she let it open all the way up, the way her mother had taught her, the way you only do when you trust the room and yourself completely. A long, clear note that climbed and then held itself in the air above the silent ballroom like something physical. Like something you could reach up and touch. Nobody breathed. Then her voice came back down, gently, like something being set carefully on a table. The last note was almost a whisper. James played the final 3 chords of the piano. And then there was nothing. Silence. Complete, total silence. Elizabeth stood at the microphone with her eyes closed and one hand resting on her belly, and the silence of 500 people surrounded her like something warm. It lasted 5 seconds. Then 10. The first sound was not applause. It was a single sob. A small, sharp, involuntary sound, the kind that escapes from a person before they have a chance to catch it, and it came from somewhere near the middle of the room. Nobody turned to look for who it was. Nobody needed to. Because within seconds of that first sound, others followed. A quiet sniff from table 7. A sharp intake of breath from somewhere near the back. The soft, careful sound of someone pressing a napkin to their face. Sarah, the bride, made no attempt to hide it. She was crying openly now, her hands still over her mouth, tears moving down her cheeks in clean lines through her carefully applied makeup. Her husband Michael was rubbing her back in slow circles and his own eyes were very bright. Mrs. Henderson from table 7, the woman who had spent the evening saying that Victor always overdid everything, was sitting with her napkin pressed against the corners of her eyes, her pearls rising and falling with each careful breath. Her husband had his hand over hers on the table. Gerald Foster, who had been watching his watch and thinking about leaving, was sitting absolutely still with his hands flat on the tablecloth and an expression on his face that a person who knew him well would have found remarkable, because Gerald Foster was a man who prided himself on never showing emotion in public, and right now his chin was trembling and he was doing nothing about it. Elizabeth opened her eyes. The room came back to her slowly, the chandeliers, the white roses, the 500 faces all turned toward the stage. She blinked once against the light. What she saw made her very still. She had imagined a lot of possible outcomes for this moment. Polite, confused applause. Awkward silence. Laughter, more laughter, louder than before, directed at her. She had prepared herself for all of those things in the seconds before she had walked out onto the stage. She had not prepared herself for this. 400s of people, many of whom were probably very proud and very private, sitting at their expensive tables with tears on their faces. For the bride crying openly in her diamond-pinned hair. For the room full of strangers who had looked at her with amusement and dismissal 10 minutes ago, now looking at her with something entirely different. Elizabeth didn't know the right word for what they were looking at her with. It took her a moment to recognize it, because she hadn't seen it directed at herself in quite a while. Respect. Then Gerald Foster started clapping. He did it without standing, just began clapping from his seat, alone, the sound of it cutting through the silence like a stone dropped in still water. It was a strong, deliberate applause, the kind that means something. The woman beside him joined in immediately. Then table 15. Then table 9. Then, in the space of about 4 seconds, the entire front half of the room. Then someone stood up. It was one of the older men from table 2, the one who had been deep in a business conversation when Elizabeth walked out, the one who hadn't looked at the stage for the first 30 seconds. He was a heavy-set man with silver hair and a red pocket square, and he rose to his feet slowly, like standing was a statement he was making deliberately, and he clapped. That was all it took. The room came to its feet in a wave, not all at once, but quickly, one table catching the movement from the next, until within 15 seconds the entire grand ballroom of the Golden Palace Resort was standing. 500 people. All of them applauding. The sound of it was enormous. It filled the room from floor to ceiling and bounced off the crystal chandeliers and came back redoubled, and Elizabeth stood at the microphone in her worn coat and her cracked shoes and received it with her hand on her belly and her eyes very bright. She did not cry. Not yet. She stood straight, the way she had stood at the service entrance when the guard first laughed at her, the way she had stood in Victor Radisson's backstage when he looked at her coat and recalculated his opinion. Straight and quiet and present. But her lips were pressed together very firmly. Thomas, standing at the back of the room with his arms still folded, uncrossed them. He looked at the stage for a long moment. Then he looked down at the floor. Then he looked back up. He started clapping too, slowly, firmly, the way a man does when he means it and isn't worried about whether anyone notices. James, at the piano, had stopped playing and was sitting on his bench with his hands in his lap, watching Elizabeth receive the standing ovation with an expression of quiet wonder. He had played at hundreds of events in this ballroom. He had accompanied famous singers and celebrated musicians, and once, at a corporate gala, a very well-known recording artist who had arrived with an entourage of 12 people. He had never felt the room do what it had just done. He turned back to his keys and played 3 quiet chords, nothing formal, just a small, private offering, and then folded his hands again and let the applause be what it was. Victor Radisson walked onto the stage. The applause shifted slightly as he appeared. Not quieter but different, the way a sound changes when its meaning changes. People were watching him now as well as Elizabeth, curious about what came next. Victor walked to the microphone. Elizabeth stepped to the side to make room for him. As she did, he paused and looked at her directly, and for a moment, just a moment, it was only the two of them in that enormous room, the billionaire in his perfect tuxedo and the homeless woman in her worn coat, standing 3 feet apart on a stage. Victor Radisson nodded at her. It was a small movement. Brief. But it was the kind of nod that means something specific. Not a greeting, not a dismissal, but an acknowledgement. The gesture of one person recognizing another person. Truly recognizing them. Elizabeth nodded back. Then Victor turned to the microphone and held up one hand. The applause gradually settled. People sat back down, slowly, reluctantly, the way people sit down when they would actually prefer to keep standing. When the room was quiet, Victor spoke. "I owe this woman an apology," he said. His voice was level, controlled as always. But there was something underneath the control tonight that Elizabeth could hear even from 3 feet away. Something that had not been there an hour ago when he was backstage with his vein pulsing and his jaw tight. The room was very still. "When Elizabeth came to me tonight," Victor continued, "I looked at her and I made a decision about who she was and what she was worth before she had said one word to me beyond her name. I looked at her clothes. I looked at her circumstances. And I decided, without any evidence, without any fairness, that she was unlikely to have anything to offer." He paused. "I was wrong." A murmur moved through the room. Not the gossipy murmur from earlier, this was different. Lower. More serious. "In 30 years of business," Victor said, "I have sat across tables from people who had everything, the right education, the right connections, the right suits, the right words, and I have been disappointed by them. And tonight a young woman walked onto this stage with none of those things, and she reminded every single person in this room what it actually means to have something real to offer." He turned slightly toward Elizabeth. "Elizabeth Parker," he said, "you've earned your $15,000. The applause started again immediately, louder this time if anything. Sarah was on her feet again in her white dress, clapping with both hands above the level of the table, not caring at all about her makeup or her carefully arranged hair. Elizabeth stood at the side of the stage and accepted it. Inside she was doing very fast, very private mathematics. $15,000. A deposit on an apartment. A real one with a lock that worked and heat that came on in the evening and a window that looked onto something other than a parking lot. Doctor's visits for the remainder of the pregnancy. A proper bed. Food, actual food in cupboards that she didn't have to ration or wonder about. A beginning. That was what $15,000 was. Not a solution to everything, not a magical ending to all difficulty, but a beginning. A foothold. A place to stand while she figured out the next thing. She was still doing this arithmetic when Victor turned back to the microphone. "However," he said. The room went quiet again immediately. The word "however" coming from Victor Radisson in a public setting had the effect of a hand raised. People stopped and paid attention. Elizabeth looked at him. $15,000 is what I promised, Victor said. And I keep my promises. But I find tonight that I am capable of more than what I promised. He reached into the inside pocket of his tuxedo jacket and produced a small white card, the kind that gets passed to assistants with instructions written on them. He looked at it for a moment. Then he put it back. "Patricia," he said without raising his voice much. Patricia appeared from the side of the stage instantly. She had clearly been standing just off stage, waiting. "Yes, sir. Call the Meridian on Monday morning. I want a 2-bedroom unit made available. Furnished. I'll cover the first year." Patricia's pen was already moving. "Also call Dr. Reeves's office. Full prenatal care through delivery and after. Everything covered." The room was completely silent now, not the polite silence of people waiting for the next thing, but the alert silence of people who are witnessing something unexpected and want to hear every word. Patricia's pen kept moving. "And call the academy." Victor paused. "Tell them I'm sponsoring a new student. Voice training. Full program." He glanced at Elizabeth. "Starting whenever she's ready." He turned back to the microphone. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said, "true value does not announce itself in advance. It does not come dressed in the right clothes or arrive at the front entrance." A brief pause. "Sometimes it knocks at the service door. And the only question that matters is whether you are wise enough to open it." He stepped back from the microphone. The room erupted. Elizabeth stood very still in the middle of all of it. The noise washed over her, applause, voices, the scrape of chairs as more people stood. Someone near the front called out something she couldn't quite make out over the general roar of it. She was thinking about a Tuesday afternoon in a small apartment on Crane Street. She was thinking about a yellow kitchen curtain and a pot of basil and the sound of a key that didn't work in a changed lock. She was thinking about her mother, about Clara Parker singing while the laundry dried, about a piano bench in a small living room, about a voice being described as a living thing that needed to breathe. She put her hand on her belly. The baby moved. A strong, clear kick. The most decisive one in days, as if the baby had been listening to everything that had just happened and had a firm opinion about it. Elizabeth laughed. It came out before she could stop it. A short, surprised, genuine laugh, alone on the stage in the middle of a standing ovation, laughing at a kick from her unborn child. She pressed her lips together and tried to compose herself, but her eyes had filled up now, finally, and there was not much she could do about that. She looked out at the room. 500 strangers who had become, in the space of one song, something she didn't have a word for yet. Not friends, she didn't know them. Not family. Something else. Witnesses, maybe. People who had been present at a moment and had been changed by it just enough to mean something. She thought, I wish you could see this, Mama. And then, because she could hear her mother's voice as clearly as if Clara Parker were standing right beside her on the stage, she heard the answer back. I can, Lizzie. I can see all of it. Patricia was an extremely efficient woman. Elizabeth had noticed this during the 10 minutes backstage before the performance. The way Patricia moved, the way she spoke, the way her pen appeared before Victor had even finished his sentence. But she saw it more clearly now, in the hour that followed the performance, as Patricia transformed from event manager into something closer to a very organized force of nature. Within 15 minutes of Victor's announcements, Elizabeth was sitting in a small private room just off the main corridor. A quiet room with soft lighting and a long couch and a coffee table, the kind of room that expensive venues kept for situations that required privacy. Someone had brought her a plate of food. Real food, not leftovers, not charity scraps, but an actual plate from the wedding dinner itself. Sliced roast beef and roasted vegetables and a roll with butter and a small bowl of something that turned out to be a very good mushroom soup. Elizabeth ate carefully at first. Then she ate with the focused attention of someone who had been hungry for 3 days and was finally allowed to stop pretending otherwise. Patricia sat across from her with a notepad and went through things in a calm, organized voice that Elizabeth found deeply comforting after an evening of uncertainty. The Meridian, one of Victor's residential properties, had a 2-bedroom apartment on the 4th floor currently unoccupied. Patricia had already left a message. The apartment was furnished, meaning there was a bed and a sofa and a kitchen table and basic appliances, which to Elizabeth sounded so extravagant she had to remind herself it was real. Dr. Reeves is one of the best obstetricians in the city, Patricia said, making a note. I'll set up your first appointment for early next week. She'll want to do a full assessment and catch up on your prenatal history. Do you have any existing medical records we should request? Some, Elizabeth said. I had appointments in the early months before, she paused. Before things changed. I can get those. Patricia nodded and wrote it down without asking for more detail, which Elizabeth appreciated. The Academy of Musical Arts runs a voice program 3 days a week, Patricia continued. Morning sessions. Mr. Radisson has arranged full sponsorship, which covers tuition, materials, and a small monthly stipend for related expenses. She looked up. That last part was his addition. He called me during the reception. Elizabeth set down her fork. He called you during the reception? He stepped away briefly. Patricia's expression remained professionally neutral, but something in it suggested this was not entirely surprising behavior. He wanted to make sure the stipend was included. He said, and I'm quoting, that talent without support is just potential, and potential doesn't pay for bus fare. Elizabeth looked at the plate in front of her for a moment. Why is he doing all of this? She asked. Patricia considered the question with the air of someone who had worked for Victor Radisson long enough to have her own answer but was deciding how much of it to share. He's a complicated man, she said finally. He can be very hard and very proud and sometimes genuinely difficult to work for. She paused. But he grew up with very little. Most people in this city don't know that about him because he doesn't talk about it. He doesn't like to. Another pause. I think tonight reminded him of something he tries not to think about too often. Elizabeth didn't ask what that something was. She picked up her fork again. Thomas knocked on the door at some point and put his head in. His big serious face was slightly different from how it had looked earlier, softer around the eyes, Elizabeth thought. He was holding an envelope. Mr. Radisson asked me to bring this, he said. Elizabeth took it. Inside was a check already written for $15,000 exactly. The signature at the bottom was a sharp, decisive signature. The kind that belongs to a person who has signed a great many important things and long ago stopped being careful about making it legible. She held it in both hands and looked at it for a moment. Then she folded it carefully and put it in the inside pocket of her coat, right against her chest, where she would know if it moved. Thomas nodded once and closed the door. By the time Elizabeth was ready to leave, close to 11 o'clock, with a food container that Patricia had insisted on packing for her, a card with the Meridian's address and a contact name, and Patricia's own direct number written on the back of a business card, the reception was still going. She could hear it as she walked back down the carpeted corridor toward the service exit. Music now from a DJ who had apparently been found somewhere, and the sound of people dancing, and bursts of laughter that were warm and real rather than the sharp, pointed laughter from earlier in the evening. A wedding carrying on. People celebrating. Elizabeth paused for a moment in the corridor and listened. Then she pushed through the door and stepped out into the night. The cold hit her immediately, the same cold that had been waiting all evening, patient and indifferent, while she had been inside in the warmth. She pulled her jacket tighter and adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. The catering trucks were gone now. The service entrance was quiet. Above her, the sky was the particular dark gray of a city sky that never quite gets fully dark because of all the light pushing up against it from below. No stars visible, but Elizabeth had gotten used to that. City skies were not for stars. City skies were for the glow of other people's windows, which had its own kind of comfort if you looked at it right. She started walking. Not toward the library bench. Not tonight. Patricia had offered to arrange a hotel room for the night, Victor's instruction apparently, and had given her a card for a place 3 blocks away. It was not the Golden Palace Resort, Patricia had said, almost apologetically, but it was clean and safe and already paid for, and there would be a room key waiting at the front desk under Elizabeth Parker. A room key. Under her name. Elizabeth walked toward it with the check against her chest and the food container in her bag and the sound of her own footsteps on the pavement, and she felt for the first time in 8 weeks, something that was not quite happiness. Happiness felt too light for what this was, but was something in the same direction. Something that had a floor under it. The hotel room was small and clean, just as Patricia had said. There was a bed with a white duvet and 2 pillows. There was a bathroom with hot water. Elizabeth discovered this immediately because the first thing she did after setting down her bag was run the shower as hot as it would go and stand under it for a very long time, with her eyes closed and the water running over her shoulders and the steam filling the small white room. She thought about nothing in particular. Or rather, she let herself think about everything in the way you can only do when you are finally safe enough to let your guard down. All the things she had been carrying, carefully, tightly, the way you carry something breakable when you're moving through a crowd, she let them loosen a little. Not drop. Not yet. But loosen. She thought about the apartment at the Meridian. 2 bedrooms. One for her and one for the baby. A room for the baby, a real room with a door and walls and a window. Not a corner of someone's floor, not a shelter cot, not a park bench. The room. She thought about Dr. Reeves and what it would feel like to have someone look after her properly, to have appointments and records and someone who knew her name and her history and the baby's heartbeat and all the careful, important details of bringing a new person into the world. She thought about singing. 3 mornings a week in a proper place with proper teaching. She tried to imagine what it would feel like, and found that she couldn't quite because she had never had formal training. All she had ever had was her mother's instructions and her own instinct. What would she be like with actual teaching behind her? What could her voice become? She pressed her hand flat against the warm, wet tiles of the shower wall and breathed. "We're going to be all right," she said quietly to the baby. She wasn't performing it for anyone. There was no one to hear her. She just said it because it was true, and because after 8 weeks of carrying it as a hope and a prayer and a desperate wish, it felt almost impossibly good to say it as a fact. The baby moved, not a kick this time but a long slow rolling motion, the whole body turning the way babies do when they are comfortable. Elizabeth smiled. She slept better that night than she had in 2 months. No cold air through the jacket. No sounds from the street. No careful, watchful half-sleep of someone who knows they are not in a safe place and keeps part of their mind on guard even when the rest is exhausted. She pulled the white duvet up and she closed her eyes and she was asleep before she had finished the thought she was in the middle of. She did not dream. Or if she did, she didn't remember the dreams. She just slept, deeply and cleanly, with one hand resting on her belly and the coat hanging over the back of the chair with the check folded safely inside it. In the morning, light came through the gap in the curtains in a long pale stripe and fell across the white duvet and across Elizabeth's face, and she woke up slowly, The way you wake up when there's no urgent thing pulling you to your feet. She lay still for a moment. She looked at the ceiling. She thought, yesterday I was sleeping on a bench. Then she thought, today is different. She got up and showered again. She could, so she did, with the simple extravagance of a person who has recently been without basic things and hasn't yet stopped being grateful for them. She ate the food from the container Patricia had packed. Cold roast beef and the remaining roll and an apple that someone had added at the last minute, which she ate down to the core. Then she sat on the edge of the bed and took the check out of her coat pocket and looked at it again in the morning light. $15,000. The numbers looked the same in daylight as they had last night. Real. She held it carefully and she thought about the practical things. A bank account first because she had closed hers 3 months ago when there was nothing left in it to keep open. She would need identification, which she had, tucked in the inside pocket of her bag. She would need to call the number on Patricia's card and confirm the apartment details. She thought about all the small, boring, necessary steps of building a life back up from nothing. And she found that she did not mind them. Boring and necessary was not nothing. Boring and necessary was exactly what a foundation looked like. She was pulling on her jacket, the same worn coat because it was still the only one she had, though that would change soon enough, when her phone buzzed. She still had her phone. It was old and the screen had a crack running diagonally across the lower right corner, but she had kept the plan paid somehow, scraping together the minimum each month from whatever small amounts came her way. It was her connection to the world, to shelters, to job listings, to the cousin in another state who checked on her occasionally. She looked at the screen. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer it. Unknown numbers were rarely good news. They were landlords and collection calls and people trying to sell things and occasionally, cruelly, spam messages about lottery winnings. She answered it. Elizabeth. The voice was familiar almost immediately, not a voice she knew well, but a voice she had heard recently enough to place it without difficulty. Low and controlled and careful. She sat back down on the edge of the bed. Mr. Radisson, she said. I hope I'm not calling too early, Victor said. His voice on the phone was slightly different from how it had sounded in person. Slightly less formal if that was possible, the way people sometimes are when they're not in a room being watched. Still controlled. Still careful. But without the layer of public performance that came with standing in front of 500 people. No, Elizabeth said. I was already up. Good. A brief pause. I wanted to make sure everything was sorted with the hotel. Patricia said she arranged it, but I prefer to confirm things myself. It was fine, Elizabeth said. It was more than fine. Thank you. Good, he said again. Another pause, slightly longer this time. The kind of pause that suggests a person is deciding something. There's something else I want to discuss with you, Victor said. Not today. Take the weekend to rest and settle. But I'd like you to come to my office on Monday, after your call to the Meridian, after whatever you need to do in the morning. Patricia will send you the address. Another pause. There's an opportunity I'd like to talk to you about. A real one. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. What kind of opportunity? She asked. The kind that's better explained in person, Victor said. I'll have Patricia include the details in the message she sends you. But Elizabeth, he stopped. Get some rest this weekend. Eat properly. Do the things you haven't been able to do. Monday is soon enough for everything else. He said goodbye and hung up. Elizabeth sat on the edge of the bed and held the phone in her lap and looked at the stripe of morning light on the carpet. She didn't know what to make of Victor Radisson. He was not easy to make anything of. He was a man who had looked at her and calculated her worth in 3 seconds and been wrong about it, and who had then stood in front of 500 people and said so plainly, which took a kind of courage that she hadn't expected from him. He was a man who gave with both hands, the check, the apartment, the medical care, the music training, but who also called at 8 in the morning to confirm the hotel arrangement, which suggested that generosity and the need for control were not mutually exclusive in him. He reminded her, in some ways she couldn't quite articulate, of herself. Not in the obvious ways. Not in wealth or power or the size of his name in the city. But in the way of someone who had decided very early that they would not be defeated by their circumstances. Who had looked at what life gave them and chosen, deliberately, repeatedly, to build something from it rather than collapse under it. She put the phone in her pocket. Then she picked up her bag, straightened her coat, and went to find a bank. The weekend passed quietly. Elizabeth was not used to quiet. She was used to the anxious quiet of exposure, the quiet of a park bench where any sound might mean danger, where rest was never fully rest because some part of her was always watching. This was different. This was the quiet of a room with a locked door and a warm radiator and no reason to keep one eye open. She slept. She ate. She found a small grocery store 2 blocks from the hotel and spent carefully, choosing things that were practical and filling things that the baby needed. She sat by the window in the evenings and watched the city in a way she hadn't been able to since Crane Street, from a position of stillness rather than survival. On Saturday afternoon she called her cousin Linda, who lived in another state and who had been her most reliable human contact during the past 8 weeks. Linda answered on the second ring. Liz? She always sounded slightly anxious when Elizabeth called, because the last several months had given her reason to be. Are you okay? I'm okay, Elizabeth said. I'm better than okay. I need to tell you something. She told her. Linda was quiet for most of it, which was unusual because Linda was not generally a quiet person. She asked 2 questions. Are you sure it's real? And is the check in a safe place? Elizabeth answered yes to both. When she finished, there was a long silence on the line. Then Linda said in a voice that was trying very hard to be normal and not quite managing it, I told you. I told you not to give up. I said it, Liz. I said it every time. You did, Elizabeth said. I'm going to need you to remember that I said it. Elizabeth laughed. A real laugh, the kind that comes from the belly, which in her case now involved the baby as well, who kicked in response as if joining in. I'll remember, she said. Good. Linda's voice had gone watery. Good. Because I've been so, she stopped. Started again. I've been scared for you. I want you to know that. Every single day. I know, Elizabeth said softly. I know you have. They talked for a long time after that. Not about practical things, about small things, the kind of things they used to talk about before everything changed. What Linda's youngest was doing in school. A television show Elizabeth had missed the last 2 months of. The way Linda's neighbor had planted an enormous hedge that was now blocking everyone else's light, and the neighborhood disagreement that had resulted. Normal things. Warm things. Elizabeth sat by the hotel window with the phone against her ear and the city lights coming on one by one as the afternoon turned to evening, and she felt the particular comfort of being known by someone who had known you for a long time. Sunday she spent mostly in silence. She walked, not the urgent, purposeful walking of a person looking for food or shelter, but the slow, observant walking of someone who is getting reacquainted with the world from a position of safety. She walked 3 blocks in each direction from the hotel. She found a small park with bare winter trees and a fountain that had been turned off for the season, and she sat on a bench she had chosen, not a bench she had been reduced to, and she stayed there for an hour. She thought about her mother. She thought about what it meant to pass something on to a child. A voice, a way of breathing, a manner of finding peace in difficult moments. Her mother had given her all of those things, had placed them in her hands so carefully and completely that even now, 8 years after Clara Parker's death, Elizabeth was still discovering new things her mother had given her. She put her hand on her belly. I'm going to give you things too, she said quietly to the baby. I'm going to give you everything I have. The park was empty except for a man walking a dog far at the other end. Nobody was watching. Nobody was within earshot. Elizabeth sat on the bench in the winter quiet and sang a few bars of something low and soft, not the wordless song from the night before but something older, one of her mother's melodies, a gentle thing that Clara used to hum while she cooked on Sunday mornings. The sound of it dissolved into the cold air. Elizabeth sat with it for a while. Then she stood up, straightened her jacket and walked back toward the hotel. Tomorrow was Monday. Patricia's message had arrived Saturday afternoon. A brief, efficient text with Victor's office address and a time, 11 o'clock. Below that, a second message. The Meridian will have your keys ready at 9. The unit number is 412. Call this number when you arrive and ask for Robert. Elizabeth read it 3 times. Unit 412. A number. A specific, real number for a specific, real place that was going to be hers. She set the alarm on her cracked screen phone for 7:30. Monday morning arrived gray and cold, with a thin layer of cloud stretched evenly across the sky in a way that made the city look like a pencil drawing of itself. Elizabeth was up before the alarm. She showered and dressed and ate the last of the groceries from Saturday, toast made with the small hotel room toaster and an orange, and the end of the carton of milk in the little refrigerator. She put on her coat. She picked up her bag. She looked around the hotel room once. The white duvet was neatly pulled up. The bathroom towel was hanging straight. Everything was as it had been when she arrived, except that she had slept in it and eaten in it and been safe in it for 2 nights, and for that she felt a gratitude that was difficult to put into proportion. She turned off the light and closed the door behind her. The Meridian was a 12-story building on Callaway Street, about 20 minutes from the hotel on foot. Elizabeth could have taken a bus. She had enough now, certainly, to take a bus and would have to remind herself of that for a while, the way you have to remind yourself of new things that have changed, but she wanted to walk. She wanted to approach it on foot, at her own pace, the way she had approached everything for the past 8 weeks, so that when she arrived it would feel earned rather than delivered. The building was not extravagant. It was not the Golden Palace or anything like it. It was a clean, solid, modern building with a glass front door and a small planted area to one side and a doorman who nodded at people as they came and went. The kind of building that said comfortable and reliable rather than look how much this cost. It was, to Elizabeth, the most beautiful building she had ever seen. She stood on the pavement in front of it for a moment. Then she went in and asked for Robert. Robert was a compact, cheerful man in his 50s with a set of keys already in his hand when he came to meet her in the lobby. He shook her hand warmly, asked how she was getting on, and did not treat her. She noticed this immediately and was grateful for it, with any of the slightly awkward, slightly pitying manner that people sometimes used when they knew your circumstances. He treated her like a tenant. Like someone who had an appointment and had arrived for it, and that was all there was to say about it. He took her up in the elevator to the 4th floor. Unit 412 was at the end of a carpeted hallway that smelled faintly of fresh paint. Robert found the key on the ring and unlocked the door and pushed it open and stepped back to let her go in first. Elizabeth stepped inside. The apartment was small but full of light, a living room with a sofa and a low table and a window that looked onto the street below. A kitchen along one wall, clean and plain, with white cabinets and a small table with 2 chairs. A short hallway leading to the bedroom, her bedroom with a real bed, made up with simple white linen, and beyond that, a second door. She opened the second door. The second bedroom was empty. Just 4 walls and a window and a bare floor and the particular quality of quiet that empty rooms have, like they are waiting patiently for whatever comes next. Elizabeth stood in the doorway of the empty room for a long moment. She was doing the calculation in her head. The weeks remaining, the things that would be needed, the way this space would look in 2 months' time with a crib in the corner and something small and new and completely trusting breathing quietly in the center of it. She pressed her hand flat against the doorframe. "Here," she whispered. "To the baby. To the room. To the idea of it. We're going to be here." Behind her, Robert waited in the hallway with the professionalism of a man who had handed over keys many times and knew that sometimes people needed a moment. He gave her one. She was in Victor's office building by 10 minutes to 11. It was a tall glass tower in the business district, the kind of building that makes you feel the city's ambition just from standing at the base of it and looking up. The lobby was marble and chrome and the ceiling was very high. People moved through it quickly and purposefully, the way people move through important spaces. Elizabeth told the woman at the front desk her name. The woman checked something on her screen, nodded, and picked up a phone. 2 minutes later a young man appeared and introduced himself as Victor's assistant. Not Patricia, who was apparently the events side of the operation, but someone named Carter who managed the office. He was polite and efficient and led her to an elevator that required a keycard to operate. The office was on the 22nd floor. The elevator opened directly into a reception area, pale wood and clean lines and another large window looking out over the city. Elizabeth looked out at the view for a moment while Carter knocked on a closed door and went in. She could see the Golden Palace Resort from here. 3 blocks away, its pale stone front visible above the other rooftops. From this distance it looked smaller than it had on Friday night, which she supposed was always the way with things you'd survived. The door opened. "He'll see you now," Carter said. Elizabeth adjusted the strap of her bag on her shoulder. Then she walked in. Victor's office was large but not showy. That was the first thing Elizabeth noticed, that for a man who owned the Golden Palace Resort and 15 other businesses and a building tall enough to see most of the city from, his personal office was surprisingly understated. A wide desk of dark wood, clean and organized. Bookshelves along one wall, filled with actual books rather than decorative objects. A single large window behind the desk. The same view of the city she had seen from the reception area, but wider from in here, more of it visible, as if the window had been designed to remind whoever sat behind that desk exactly what they were responsible for. Victor was standing when she came in, which she hadn't expected. He gestured to one of the 2 chairs on the near side of the desk. "Sit down, Elizabeth. Please." She sat. He sat. On the desk between them was a folder, closed, and 2 cups of coffee that Carter must have placed there just before she arrived. Still steaming, which meant the timing had been carefully managed. Of course it had. "How is the apartment?" Victor asked. "I picked up the keys this morning," she said. "It's perfect. More than I. She paused, not wanting to finish the sentence in a way that sounded like she was performing gratitude. It's exactly what we need. Thank you. He nodded once. Good. He looked at the folder on the desk but didn't open it yet. And the hotel was adequate for the weekend? Yes. Good, he said again. He was quiet for a moment, in the way she was beginning to understand was characteristic of him. Not uncomfortable silence, but the silence of a man who thought before he spoke and saw no reason to apologize for it. Then he said, I'm going to tell you something that very few people in this city know. Elizabeth waited. Victor folded his hands on the desk and looked at them for a moment. Then he looked up at her. I grew up on Fletcher Street, he said. Do you know it? Elizabeth knew it. Fletcher Street was on the east side of the city, a neighborhood of narrow houses and small shops and cracked pavements, the kind of neighborhood that the rest of the city drove through rather than to. Yes, she said. My mother worked 2 jobs, Victor said. My father left when I was 9. We had, he paused, choosing the word carefully, very little. There were months when very little became almost nothing. He looked at her steadily. I know what it means to be hungry and not show it. I know what it means to walk past places you can't afford and pretend you don't want to go inside. Elizabeth said nothing. She was listening with her whole self. I also know, Victor continued, what it means to have something inside you that the outside world can't see yet. Something real. He looked at her for a moment. Friday night you reminded me of that. You reminded me in a way I wasn't expecting and, a brief pause, wasn't entirely prepared for. He opened the folder. Inside were several pages of what looked like a formal document, printed neatly with headings and sections. He turned it so it faced her and slid it across the desk. What I'd like to discuss with you, he said, is this. Elizabeth looked at the document. At the top of the first page in clean black letters were the words, Parker Music Development Agreement, Draft Proposal. Her name. On a document. In an office on the 22nd floor. She looked up at Victor. The academy training is already arranged, he said. That stands regardless of what you decide today. This is something separate. He leaned forward slightly. One of my properties, the Harrington Hotel 3 blocks from here, has a restaurant and a bar. The bar has a small performance space. We've been running a rotation of local musicians on Friday and Saturday evenings for the past 2 years. Pause. The current rotation has been adequate. It hasn't been remarkable. Elizabeth looked at the document again. What I'm proposing, Victor said, is a residency. Not immediately, you'd need time to train, to build material, to be ready. I'm thinking 6 months from now, perhaps. Friday evenings, 8 o'clock, 2 hours. A proper setup, good sound, good lighting, proper promotion. Another pause. I want it done right. Not as a charity, not as a story. As a genuine performance. Elizabeth was quiet for a moment. You heard me sing one song, she said. Yes, Victor said. One song in a moment of, she searched for the word, in a moment of extremity. I don't know if I can do that consistently. On a regular stage, on ordinary evenings, for regular audiences who are just out for a Friday night. Victor looked at her steadily. Neither do I, he said. She blinked. I think you can, he continued. I think what I heard on Friday was not a one-time occurrence. I think it was the natural expression of a very significant gift. Pause. But I'm also a businessman, Elizabeth, and I don't make promises I'm not certain about. That's why the training comes first. 6 months. You work with the academy, you develop your range and your material, and then we revisit this conversation. He tapped the document. This is a draft. A statement of intent. Nothing is signed today. Elizabeth looked at the pages. She thought about Friday evening, standing at the microphone with the light in her eyes and 500 faces looking up at her. She thought about the way the room had gone quiet. She thought about James at the piano, his eyes moving between his keys and her back, following where she led. She thought about her mother. Can I take this with me? She asked. To read properly. Of course, Victor said. Take as long as you need. He paused. Within reason. Something in the way he said it, dry but with a very slight movement at the corner of his mouth, made Elizabeth almost smile. What does within reason mean to you? She asked. A week, he said. And this time the corner of his mouth moved a little more. I'm a patient man, Elizabeth. But I'm not a monk. She left the office building at 12:10. The gray morning had turned into a gray midday, the clouds still spread evenly overhead, the air still cold but without the bitter edge of the weekend. Elizabeth stood on the pavement outside the glass tower and held the folder under one arm and breathed. A week ago she had been on a bench. She had been counting crackers and watching other people's lights go on and telling her unborn baby to be patient, that things would get better, that she would find a way. She had been saying it with her voice while her body, cold and hungry and exhausted, told a different story. And now she was standing outside a 22-story building with a performance agreement draft under her arm and a key to apartment 412 in her pocket and a check for $15,000 at the bank she had visited on Saturday morning, which had looked at her identification and opened her account without drama or ceremony, as if people walked in from nowhere and deposited $15,000 every day. She started walking. Not toward anywhere in particular, just walking the way she had learned to do when she needed to think. The city moved around her. People with coffee cups, a delivery cyclist weaving between cars, a woman pushing a stroller, two men arguing cheerfully outside a hardware store. She walked for 20 minutes. Then her phone buzzed. She expected Patricia, or Linda, or a notification from the bank. It was none of those things. The name on the screen was one she hadn't seen in 3 months. Daniel. She stopped walking. She stood on the pavement with people moving around her and she looked at the name on the screen and she felt, not the surge of pain she might have expected, not the old familiar ache of the yellow kitchen curtain and the 7-word note. She felt something quieter than that. Something that had more distance in it. She let it ring. She watched the screen until it went to voicemail. Then she put the phone in her pocket and kept walking. He called again 20 minutes later. She let it ring again. The third time she was back at the Meridian, standing in the lobby waiting for the elevator, and she looked at the name and thought, he will keep calling. That was the thing she knew about Daniel. Even now, he was persistent when he wanted something. It was the quality that had made him a good mechanic, always chasing the fault in an engine until he found it. It had not, in the end, made him a good husband, but it was there. She answered. Liz. His voice was, she searched for the word, diminished. That was it. The Daniel she had known had a voice with a certain weight to it, a confidence. This voice had less of that. Liz, please don't hang up. I wasn't going to hang up, she said. I'm listening. Pause. He seemed to have been prepared for an argument and her calmness had disarmed him slightly. I heard about what happened, he said. The wedding. The singing. It's all over the city, Liz. People are talking about it. I know, she said. I saw a video. Pause. Someone at the reception filmed it. It's been shared, a lot of people have seen it. Elizabeth was quiet. She hadn't known about a video. You were incredible, Daniel said. His voice had something in it that she recognized from a long time ago, from before the lottery, before the new friends, before the tuxedo she'd never seen and the watch collection and the 7 words on a piece of paper. Something genuine. Something that might have been the real Daniel, the one under all the rest of it. I watched it 4 times. She stepped into the elevator. The doors closed. Daniel, she said. What do you want? Another pause. Longer this time. I want to see you, he said. I want to talk. I know I don't have the right to ask that. I know what I did and I know it was. He seemed to struggle with the next word as if the English language had not given him one big enough for what he needed. Wrong. Was wrong, Liz. I know that. The elevator doors opened at the 4th floor. Elizabeth walked down the carpeted hallway toward Unit 412. She found the key in her pocket. She put it in the lock. She turned it and heard the small, clean click of a door opening to a place that was hers. She stepped inside. Daniel, she said quietly, standing in the doorway of the apartment with the morning light coming through the living room window in long pale rectangles across the floor. I'm going to tell you something, and I want you to listen carefully. I'm listening, he said. I am standing in my apartment, she said. My apartment. For the first time in 8 weeks I have a key that works and a lock that is mine and a room for the baby. She paused. And I got here because of me. Because of what was inside me that nobody could take away. Not you, not the landlord, not the cold, not any of it. She could hear him breathing on the other end. I'm not angry at you, she continued. She walked slowly into the living room and stood at the window looking down at Callaway Street below. I was angry for a long time. I was frightened and alone and I had every reason to fall apart. And I didn't, and that had nothing to do with you. Pause. But neither did any of the good things that are happening now. This apartment. This chance. None of it came from you. It came from me standing on a stage and doing the thing I was born to do, even when everyone in the room was laughing. I know, Daniel said. His voice was very quiet. You left me, Elizabeth said. You left me 7 months pregnant with nowhere to go. And before that, before you left, I watched you choose strangers over our life one day at a time, and I tried to reach you and I couldn't." She paused. "You didn't just leave me, Daniel. You left your child. And that child is going to arrive in this world in 2 months, and they are going to grow up in this apartment, and they are going to hear their mother sing, and they are going to be—" She stopped for a moment. "They are going to be loved completely, fiercely, without condition." She heard him exhale, a long, unsteady breath. "I just want to be a part of that," he said. "I know I don't deserve it. I'm not asking you to, I'm not asking about us. I just want a chance. For the baby." Elizabeth was quiet for a long time. She looked out the window at the gray city below, at the people moving along the pavement, at the delivery trucks and the cyclists and the couple walking a dog on the corner and all the ordinary, continuous movement of people living their lives. She thought about what her child deserved. She thought about it carefully because it mattered more than anything else in the conversation. She thought about fathers. She thought about what a father was supposed to be, not the romantic idea of it, not the version from films and greeting cards, but the real thing, the daily thing. The person who shows up not just when it's easy or exciting or new, but when it's hard and boring and demanding and inconvenient. The person who stays. Daniel had not stayed. But she also thought about her own childhood, about growing up without knowing her father, who had been gone before she was old enough to remember his face. She thought about the particular shape of that absence, the way it had no sharp edges because there was nothing to define it against, just a space where something should have been. She had never been bitter about it. Her mother had been enough, more than enough in so many ways, but the space had been there. She had felt it, quietly, in the particular way that children feel things they don't have words for yet. Did she want that for her child? She was honest with herself, the way she had always tried to be. She stood at the window of apartment 412 and she was honest. No, she did not want that. But wanting her child to have a father and being willing to pretend that nothing had happened were not the same thing. They were not even close to the same thing. "Daniel," she said finally. "I'm here," he said. "I'm going to say this once clearly, and I need you to hear all of it." "Okay." She took a breath. "If you want to be in this child's life," she said, "that is a conversation for after they are born. After they are here and safe and I have had time to find my feet. Not now, not while I am still putting things back together." Pause. "And it would not be a casual thing. It would not be you appearing when you feel like it and disappearing when life gets complicated. It would mean being consistent, being present, being the kind of person a child can rely on." Another pause. "Which is a kind of person you have not shown me you can be." Daniel was quiet. "I know," he said. "So I am not saying never," Elizabeth said. "I am saying not yet. And I am saying that yet will only come if I see, over time with evidence, that you have actually changed. Not that you feel bad. Not that you are sorry. That you have changed." She looked out the window. "Because my child deserves a father who stays. And if you cannot be that person, then it is better for them to grow up without you than to grow up watching you leave over and over again." The silence on the phone was long. When Daniel finally spoke, his voice was different from any voice she had heard from him in a long time. Stripped of the confidence, stripped of the new money swagger, stripped of every layer the lottery had added and the reckless spending had then taken away. Just the voice underneath all of it. "That's fair," he said. Elizabeth had been prepared for an argument. For pleading, or pressure, or the particular kind of persuasion Daniel had always been capable of when he wanted something. She had not been prepared for those two quiet words. She closed her eyes for a moment. "Take care of yourself, Daniel," she said. She ended the call. She stood at the window for a while after that. The gray sky had begun to thin at the edges. Not sunshine exactly, but a lightening, the kind that suggests the cloud cover is considering its options. Below on Callaway Street, life continued at its usual pace. Elizabeth pressed her forehead gently against the cool glass. She felt, not happy, not sad. Something in between those things that didn't have a clean name. The feeling of having handled something difficult without flinching. The feeling of knowing exactly who you are and what you will and will not accept and saying so plainly and meaning every word. Her mother would have been proud of her. She was quietly proud of herself. The baby kicked, one strong, decisive kick, right in the middle of everything. Elizabeth laughed and pressed her hand to her belly. "I know," she said. "I know. I handled it." The weeks that followed were the busiest of Elizabeth's life. Not the desperate busy of survival, not the constant, exhausting business of finding food and warmth and safety, which took everything you had and gave nothing back. This was different. This was the busy of building, of putting one thing after another in the right place and watching something take shape. She started at the Academy of Musical Arts on a Wednesday morning, 3 weeks after the wedding. The building was old and slightly shabby in the comfortable way of places that have been used seriously for a long time, worn wooden floors and high ceilings and the sound of music coming from behind closed doors as you walk the corridors. Scales on a piano from one room. A cello working through something slow and complicated from another. Her teacher's name was Margaret. Margaret was a small woman in her 60s with silver hair cut very short and reading glasses on a chain around her neck and the particular manner of someone who had spent decades listening very carefully to voices and had developed strong opinions about all of them. She shook Elizabeth's hand at their first meeting, sat her down and said, "Sing something for me. Anything. Don't think about it, just sing." Elizabeth sang. Margaret listened with her eyes closed and her head slightly tilted. The way a person listens when they are hearing something technically rather than just receiving it. When Elizabeth finished, Margaret opened her eyes. "Well," she said. Victor wasn't exaggerating. She picked up a pen and opened a notebook. "We have work to do. Your breath control needs development and your upper range is untrained. But the instrument itself," she tapped her pen against the notebook, "the instrument is remarkable. Do you understand what I mean by that?" "I think so," Elizabeth said. "I mean that what you have cannot be taught," Margaret said plainly. "It can only be found and then refined. I've been teaching for 40 years and I can count on one hand the number of students who came to me with something genuinely original in their voice." She looked at Elizabeth over her glasses. "You are one of them." Elizabeth held those words carefully, the way you hold something that might be fragile. "My mother gave it to me," she said. Margaret nodded slowly. "Then your mother gave you a great deal," she said. And then, without further ceremony, she opened to the first page of the notebook and said, "Let's begin." 3 mornings a week, Elizabeth went to the academy. She learned things she hadn't known she didn't know, about breath and resonance and the architecture of a song, about the difference between singing from the chest and singing from somewhere deeper, about how the body is an instrument and must be treated as one. Margaret was exacting and unsentimental and occasionally sharp, and Elizabeth loved every minute of it. She moved properly into apartment 412. Linda sent a package from out of state, a soft yellow blanket for the baby, and a card that said "I told you so" in large letters, and a small framed photograph of their mothers together, young women in someone's garden, laughing at something outside the frame. Elizabeth put the photograph on the windowsill in the living room, where the morning light fell on it. She bought things for the second bedroom, slowly, carefully, with the attention of someone who had learned not to take any of it for granted. A crib. A small chest of drawers. A mobile that hung above the crib and turned gently in the draft from the window, casting small shadows on the wall. A yellow curtain, which she hung herself and which made her cry a little, in a way that was not sad. Dr. Reeves turned out to be a calm, thorough, warm woman who looked at Elizabeth's medical history without comment and then looked at Elizabeth herself and said, "You and this baby have clearly been taking care of each other. Everything looks good. Let's keep it that way." She scheduled monthly appointments and then weekly ones as the due date approached, and at each one Elizabeth left feeling steadied, held in the careful, professional attention of someone who knew what they were doing. The city's attention, meanwhile, had been steadily finding her. The video from the wedding, filmed on someone's phone and shared without much thought, the way things are, had moved through the world in the weeks after the wedding in the particular way that true things move when they find the right moment. A local news station had picked it up first. Then a national one. Then several more. Elizabeth's phone, the old crack-screen phone which she had not yet replaced because she kept forgetting to, began ringing with numbers she didn't recognize. Journalists. Radio producers. A television talk show. A record label which made her sit down when she heard the message. She didn't answer most of them. Not yet. She showed them to Patricia, who had somehow become a reliable fixture in her life, appearing periodically with organized information and practical advice and the occasional dry observation that Elizabeth had come to appreciate. "You don't need to respond to any of these right now," Patricia told her at one of their meetings, going through the messages with her characteristic efficiency. "You're 6 weeks from your due date. The music is developing. The residency conversation with Mr. Radisson is on hold until after the baby arrives, as discussed." She looked up from her notepad. "The world will still be interested in 3 months. Genuine things don't expire." "And the record label?" Elizabeth asked. Patricia's expression remained professionally neutral. "I've let them know you're aware of their interest and will be in contact at the appropriate time." Pause. "They were very polite about waiting. They are rarely polite about waiting." Elizabeth filed all of it away in the part of her mind that was learning to hold the future without being overwhelmed by it. One thing at a time. The baby first. Then everything else. Her daughter arrived on a Tuesday morning in early spring. Elizabeth had chosen not to find out beforehand whether it was a girl or a boy. She had wanted to be surprised, had wanted to experience that particular unrepeatable moment of meeting someone for the first time in the fullest sense of it. And so when Dr. Reeves placed the baby in her arms and said, "It's a girl," Elizabeth experienced the words as both completely unexpected and somehow deeply inevitable, as if this was always who had been coming. She looked at the small red face, the dark eyes blinking against the light, the tiny fingers curled and uncurling in the unfamiliar air. "Hello," Elizabeth said. Her voice was very soft. A whisper, really? Just for the two of them. The baby looked at her, not focused, not really, because newborn eyes don't work that way, but turned toward her, oriented toward the sound of her voice the way a plant turns toward light. Elizabeth pressed her lips to the small forehead. "I've been talking to you for months," she whispered. "I have so many things to tell you." Linda was in the waiting room and came in 10 minutes later and cried so immediately and completely that a nurse looked concerned. Elizabeth laughed, which made Linda cry more, which made Elizabeth laugh more. "She's perfect," Linda managed eventually. "I know," Elizabeth said. "What are you going to call her?" Elizabeth looked down at the baby in her arms. She had thought about names for weeks, lists and combinations and meanings, the way you think about something important. But looking at the small face now, she found she already knew. "Clara," she said. Linda pressed her hand over her mouth. Her eyes filled again. "After your mom," she said. "After my mom," Elizabeth said. Clara Parker was 4 months old when Elizabeth stood on the stage of the Harrington Hotel bar for the first time. The room held about 80 people, not 500, not a grand ballroom, but a warm and intimate space with good acoustics and soft lighting and tables arranged in a curve around the small stage. Every seat was taken. Several people were standing along the back wall. Word had traveled the way it does. Victor Radisson was there, at a corner table, not in a tuxedo this time but in a dark jacket, looking like a man who was present because he wanted to be and not because anyone expected it of him. He had a glass of water in front of him and a small notebook, which Elizabeth suspected he brought everywhere out of habit. Margaret was there, her voice teacher, sitting very straight in a chair near the side, with her reading glasses on their chain and her hands folded in her lap and an expression of focused anticipation that was, for Margaret, approximately equivalent to wild excitement. James was there. The pianist from the wedding. He had agreed immediately without hesitation, when Elizabeth had called to ask if he would accompany her at the residency. He was already at the piano when she arrived, warming up with the easy confidence of someone who had found the right place to be. Thomas was there, off-duty in regular clothes, looking slightly unfamiliar without his uniform. He gave her a brief nod from his table when she walked past. She nodded back. Patricia was there because Patricia was always where she needed to be. And Linda was there. She had driven 4 hours that afternoon and would drive back in the morning because she had work, and had told Elizabeth she would drive 400 hours if that was what was required, which Elizabeth believed completely. Elizabeth stood backstage, a small room to the left of the stage with a mirror and a chair and a narrow window, and she looked at herself. She was wearing a dress she had bought 2 weeks ago for exactly this occasion. It was simple and dark blue and fit her well, and she had her hair down the way she rarely wore it. She looked, she thought, like a person who was about to do something they were ready for. She looked like herself. She could hear the quiet murmur of the audience through the thin wall. 80 people who had come on a Friday evening to hear her sing, who had heard about the wedding or seen the video, or read the article in the city paper that had run the week before, or been told by someone who had been told by someone else. All of them waiting. She put her hand flat against the wall for a moment. She thought about a bench outside a public library. She thought about a service entrance and a smell of food and a laugh from a security guard who had not believed her. She thought about standing at a microphone with 500 people laughing and choosing to open her mouth anyway. She thought about Clara, little Clara, home with Linda's cousin who had come in specifically to babysit, asleep in her crib under the mobile that cast small shadows on the wall, in the room that had been waiting for her. She thought about her mother. "Your voice is a living thing, Lizzie. Don't push it. Let it open up on its own like a door." Elizabeth breathed, long and slow all the way down to the bottom of herself. Then she walked out onto the stage. The applause when she appeared was warm and immediate, the applause of people who were already with her before she had sung a single note, which was both a gift and its own kind of pressure, and Elizabeth received it with a quiet smile and let it settle before she stepped up to the microphone. James played the opening notes. Soft, careful. The same instinct as the first time, which was one of the reasons she had wanted him here. Elizabeth closed her eyes. She thought about everything she had. The apartment with the yellow curtain. The small face of her daughter blinking in the light. Margaret's voice saying the instrument is remarkable. The key in her pocket and the check that had become a bank account that had become a beginning. She thought about everything she had lost. The Crane Street apartment and the Friday night pizzas and the life that had been small but warm and entirely hers. The trust she had placed in someone who had not deserved it. The 8 weeks of cold and hunger and invisibleness and fear. She held all of it, the loss and the gain, the before and the after, the bench and the stage. She held it the way a voice holds a note. Completely. Without flinching. And she sang. The room went quiet almost immediately. Not gradually, the way it had at the wedding. There was no crowd to slowly convert, no laughter to overcome. These people had come to listen, and they listened from the very first note, with the complete attention of people who understood they were in the presence of something real. Elizabeth sang for 2 hours. She sang the wordless song from the wedding, which several people recognized from the video and which landed differently now, not as a desperate offering from a stranger, but as something mastered and owned and offered freely. She sang songs with words, things she had been developing with Margaret over the months, melodies built from her own life and her own experience, some of them quiet and some of them larger. She sang one song she had written specifically about that Friday evening, about standing at a service entrance hungry and afraid and choosing to walk through the door anyway, and that was the one that made the room cry. She sang at the very end, something she had never sung for anyone before. A song she had learned from her mother. Clara's song. The melody she had heard while laundry dried on a line and Sunday dinners cooked on the stove, the one she had sung quietly in a winter park on a Sunday afternoon 2 days after everything changed. She had arranged it, properly with Margaret's help, built it out from memory into something full. She sang it now, in a room of strangers, for a daughter asleep 4 miles away. The last note hung in the air above the Harrington Hotel bar for a long moment after James had played his final chord. Then Elizabeth opened her eyes. She looked out at the room. Every person in it was still. Victor Radisson, at his corner table, was looking at her with his hands flat on the table and an expression she now recognized, the same one from the wedding, the one that had no performance in it. Just a man seeing something true and letting it land. Margaret had her eyes closed and her hands still folded and was very quietly nodding to herself, the way someone nods when a thing they believed has been confirmed. Linda, at a table near the back, was not even trying. Ann Thomas, off-duty Thomas, who had turned her away at a service entrance on a cold evening and then given her a chance because something in her steady eyes had made him pause. Thomas was sitting with his big hands wrapped around his glass, looking at the stage with an expression of complete, uncomplicated happiness. The applause began. It filled the room and kept going, long past the point where applause usually settles, longer than the evening had perhaps prepared anyone to expect, and Elizabeth stood at the microphone and received it. Not as a rescued woman. Not as a story. Not as a homeless pregnant stranger who had surprised everyone and become a news segment and a viral video. As a singer. As Elizabeth Parker, who had a daughter named Clara and an apartment on Calloway Street and 3 mornings a week at the academy and a voice that her mother had given her and that she was, from this evening forward, giving to the world. She pressed her hand briefly to her chest. We lost everything, she thought. But we found our strength. She looked out at the room. She smiled, a full, real, complete smile, the kind her face was made for. And she took her bow. I hope you enjoyed watching it as much as I enjoyed creating it. Like, share and comment on the lessons you've learned. Let me know where you're watching from in the comments below. See you in my next video.